Cale! Here's Clark. Who? Who's this guy?
Cale, it must be a happy day for you, huh?
To the Cale Clark Show. It's so good to be with you, joined as always by producer Lucas Holton. Lucas, I know you're a little bit under the weather. You may not be cracking open any beverages of choice, just sticking with water, huh?
Yeah, it's probably better for me anyway. But
That's true. It's hard to argue with that. Hard to argue with that. But okay, sounds good. Well, listen, let me crack open this Diet Coke. And as I always say, I'm still open for sponsorships if you're out there. So anyways, it's been a hot minute since we've had a show, and I've been on the road. I just got back from Iowa, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'd never been to Iowa before, Lucas. Caitlin Clark country, of course, where she started at the University of Iowa. And no relation. She's Clark with a K. She doesn't spell it right. I can hit the odd 3-pointer. There's no question about that, but she's got me a beat there. And I was speaking at the fundraising banquet for KMMK 88.7 FM, Catholic radio to the max. And they do mean that literally, because their patron saint is Maximilian Kolbe. Tony and Susan May, the proprietors of this fine station, carry my Faith Explained show, and they all loved the Cale Clark Show as well. So I gave a talk there at their banquet about the Shroud of Turin, and it was really exciting because they had a Shroud of Turin exhibit that was also there at the fundraising dinner. Lots of incredible information about the Shroud and images of the Shroud. So it really went nicely with my talk. And we have spoken about the Shroud on this program before, Lucas, but today, I want to talk about some other archaeological discoveries related to Jesus and his world. And in fact, Lucas, I used to call them the Great Eight, with apologies to Alexander Ovechkin of the Washington Capitals, who wears jersey number 8. He's always called the Great Eight. These were the Great Eight archaeological discoveries related to Jesus. And there could have been more in the list, but kind of went with 8. I've expanded that list now to 10 because of the Shroud and the new evidence. We talked about this in a previous podcast, as I mentioned, new evidence for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. I would say, Lucas, that I'm about 98% sure, if not 99.7% sure, that it is in fact the burial shroud of Jesus. I think it's pretty much a slam dunk now. So I've added the Shroud to the list plus one more. And so we've moved from a Great 8 list to a top 10 list. So echoes of David Letterman. And believe me, I spent far too much time watching David Letterman when I was in high school, staying up way too late past my bedtime on school nights. But I used to love Dave and these top 10 lists. So what do you say tonight we look at some of these, other than the Shroud? The Shroud is in the list, but let's look at some of these other top 10 discoveries related to Jesus and his world. How about that, Lucas?
That sounds good. Sounds good. I know nothing of these, by the way, so
really?
All of my reactions will be completely fresh.
I love it.
Except the Shroud, obviously. But yeah,
except the Shroud.
Speaking of David Letterman, by the way, I have to give a shout out to my brother and the godmother of my son, Megan, who both went to Ball State University, which is where David Letterman of course, went, and they have all the kinds of media stuff there. But
David Letterman is a famous stand for Ball State University. Absolutely, they probably got a lot of students because of him throughout the years. So, all right, well, here's what we'll do. We'll go through the list of the top 10 archaeological discoveries. Do you want me to do the whole list first, and then we'll talk about each one, or do you want to just do you want them to be a surprise, Lucas?
Oh man. Let's do the surprise.
Okay, let's do the surprise. I agree. Okay, so the first archaeological discovery of note, and again, there could have been many more, but these are just the ones that are picked here. The first archaeological discovery of note relating to Jesus and his world is this: the discovery of a stone inscription dating from the 1st century, having to do with Pontius Pilate. And maybe before I say what that was, it might be good just to define some terms a little bit. Like, what is archaeology exactly? Well, archaeology, of course, is an academic discipline, but it's also the study of the uncovering of material culture from the past, artifacts, documents, buildings, um, all kinds of different things, pieces of pottery, coins. And by the way, those are great to discover, coins, because when you're doing archaeology, and I did not study archaeology specifically, but when I was doing my New Testament studies in grad school, my professor, Dr. Craig Evans, and I, along with some other students, went to Israel and worked on an archaeological dig for 2 summers right outside the old city walls of Jerusalem, very, very close from, just steps away from the Church of the Dormition. For anybody listening who's ever been there, and I've taken pilgrimage groups there in the past, this is the traditional site where Mary was assumed into heaven. So outside of the old city walls of Jerusalem, we worked on this dig because it is related to New Testament studies. Archaeology helps us to understand Jesus and his world. Now, what we found there was, and this is a dig that had been worked on for years before we got there, and was worked on for years afterwards. And it's now a beautiful, sort of almost like a museum site that you can go to. What we found was the ruins of a high priestly mansion from the time of Jesus. It was pretty incredible stuff. These guys were living high on the hog, Lucas. We found a bathtub. Nobody had their own bathtubs in the first century. I mean, these guys, you can see why Jesus was mad at them for being greedy and avaricious and not looking after the people, but looking after themselves. We found lots of evidence of that in this first century priestly mansion. But I remember that one day in particular, Dr. Evans, my professor, was really excited because he found a coin. I have this picture of him just smiling from ear to ear, holding this coin. Now, it's important when you find a coin because that helps you to date where you're at, because most coins do have a date on them. And when you're doing archaeology, it's a little bit like digging through a layer cake, because every layer or strata that you go down deeper into the earth, you're going back further into an older time period. So when you find a coin, that's awesome because you can date sort of where you're at. And this is really, really important. Well, speaking of dates, Pontius Pilate was certainly active in the first century. He helped to condemn Jesus to death. In fact, he gave the final order. And Lucas, there are a few crackpots out there, not too many of them, who doubt that Jesus actually was a historical person. There's plenty of evidence that he was. Some people even doubted the existence of Pontius Pilate. They thought that he was a made-up figure as well. That was thoroughly debunked by this find, the discovery of an inscription bearing the name of Pontius Pilate from the first century. And it was found in 1961 during some excavations at Caesarea Maritima, or as I like to call it, Caesar's by the Sea. It was kind of a proto Las Vegas, if you will. Herod the Great, Herod the Not So Great, of course, who tried to kill the infant Jesus. I keep saying this. Somebody's got to make a movie, a Hollywood movie about the life of Herod the Great. I mean, it's got everything: swashbuckling, action, intrigue, romance, murder. I'm really surprised that nobody's done a large-scale movie about Herod yet. But one of the things that he did was he made this sort of seaside resort, if you will, at Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast. And there was a hippodrome there where a lot of contests were held, a theater, and it was in that theater, the ruins of the theater, that some Italian archaeologists, they were kind of walking up the steps of the theater, these limestone steps. And as they were doing this, that one guy took a step, and the limestone kind of shifted, it was loose underneath him. And to their credit, because they're curious, because they're archaeologists, they decided to say, well, it's on the other side. Let's just lift up this loose stone just in case there's something there. Well, it's a good thing they did, because they found an incredible inscription about Pontius Pilate. And not all the words are there, but we can piece it together. And it says something Tiberium Pontius Pilatus Prefectus Judaeae. What does that mean? Something Tiberium, or Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. What it probably was an inscription dedicated by the people of Tiberius, or under the reign of Tiberius, thanking Pontius Pilate or noting some great achievement of Pontius Pilate in the first century. And this, I don't know, it was maybe a monument that was set up. Well, very often these things are repurposed. When they break down, they're used for other stuff. And they just use this monument as a step in the theater. So there we have it, written in stone. And another cool thing about it, it tells us what Pontius Pilate actually was. He was a prefect. People say, was he a procurator or a prefect? You might say that is semantics. To some extent, yes, but that was his actual title, prefect of Judea. So he was a real guy, and we have it written in stone, coheres, of course, with the witness of the gospel. So he's a real guy. He was the prefect. He was not a pilot of a plane, as I thought when I was a kid. Hearing the creed at Mass, I thought, who is Pontius Pilate? A guy who flew a plane. In fact, I was texting you about this earlier, and it auto-corrected to punches Pilate, like with your fist, your punches Pilate. Yeah, we would like to punch Pilate, that's for sure, for what he did. But having said that, no, I used to think he was like Snoopy, like the Red Baron, flying around a plane. That's how I thought of it as a kid. No, I had no idea that was his name, but he was in fact the prefect of Judea. So that the Pontius Pilate inscription was a really, really important find. So that was number one in our top 10 list of archaeological finds relating to Jesus and his world. The second one is the ossuary, or the bone box, that belonged to Caiaphas, the high priest, and also a bone box belonging to his granddaughter. So Joseph Caiaphas, or Joe Caiaphas as I like to call him, he was the high priest at the time of Jesus, of course, at the time of his crucifixion. And he was the one who obviously pronounced the sentence that Jesus was worthy of death for the crime of blasphemy. But of course, the Romans were occupying the Holy Land at that time, Roman Palestine as it was known then. And so they had no authority to carry out capital punishment. That had to be done by the Romans. There's lots of evidence that Pilate was in cahoots with Caiaphas on a lot of different stuff. Anyways, he hands Jesus over to Pilate. Pilate is the one who actually has him crucified. Now, Joseph Caiaphas, by the way, he reigned from 18 AD in the first century, from the years 18 to 36. And most scholars think that Jesus was crucified at about the year AD 30. So he was the guy. And of course, the priesthood, the high priesthood, was kind of passed on through the family. And the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who is known as Annas, he's mentioned in John's gospel. And in John chapter 18, you can sort of read about that. And he's mentioned also when the Gospel of John is read during the Passion narratives, and you can read it, of course, in the Gospel for yourself. So there we have it here. We have Caiaphas, and an ossuary, or a bone box, was discovered belonging to him outside of Jerusalem. This happened in 1990. There was some construction that was going on, and this is a very, very common occurrence in Israel. Whenever there's a building being put up, foundations are being dug, there's so much history in Israel that you're almost guaranteed to find something of note historically. Well, according to the law, if you find anything that's historic, you have to notify the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, and you have to stop all construction until the archaeologists can get in there, the scholars can get in there, and you need to make sure that if this is really important, you have to stop the building project. And there's lots of examples of buildings that had to build around holy sites that have been found. I remember one, there was like a sort of a bubble, a glass bubble courtyard. Underneath was a holy site, and they had to build the building kind of around it. Wasn't their original plan. But in 1990, in the Peace Forest, which is a park which is just south of Jerusalem's Old City, a bulldozer came upon, like sort of digging in the ground, and unearthed an ancient tomb from the first century. And the tomb had been looted. Grave robbing was very, very common back in the day, but there were still some intact ossuaries. Now you say, what's an ossuary? It's a limestone bone box. Now, what is the purpose of this bone box? Well, the way that the Jews at the time of Jesus did burial was they practiced something known as secondary burial. So after you died, your body was anointed and embalmed, if you will, and put in a tomb. But then a year later, at the anniversary of the death, you would come back because the body has decomposed by then. You would come back and collect the bones of the deceased, with the flesh having rotted away. And you would collect the bones, put them in a limestone bone box or ossuary, and there'd be a family crypt, a family tomb. So there'd be little shelves, if you will, on the inside of these tombs, and everyone's ossuary would kind of go on the shelf. So Uncle Joe's over here, your dad is here. Everybody's got their own shelf within the family tomb. Now, why did they do this? Well, the answer is actually more simple than you might think. It's so it'd be easier for God to put the person back together again at the resurrection on the last day. Not that God needs the help, but that was the theological motivation behind it, at least in part. And so that's what these bone boxes are all about. This explains a lot of things about the gospel. For example, in Luke chapter 9, Matthew chapter 8, you can read about a would-be disciple of Jesus who says, Lord, I want to follow you, but first let me go and bury my father. And Jesus says, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Now, people think Jesus is being cruel here. I mean, this guy's father is dying. Can't he just go and be by his bedside and say his goodbyes and then maybe go follow Jesus? I mean, you only have one dad, right? Well, Jesus is not being cruel. It does, of course, the account does emphasize the priority of the gospel and following Jesus over all, even family ties. But this guy's dad is already dead. Dad is dead. Now, what's going on here? It's coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the father's death and burial. And they have to go into the tomb, collect the bones, and put them in the bone box for the final secondary burial. That's what's going on here. He's already dead. Jesus isn't being cruel. You hear my dog just kind of shaking there. I don't know if you heard that, but at any rate, I'm going to doggedly follow this through. I lost my train of thought there, but yeah, Poppy, go back to bed. Anyways, that's what's going on here. This is secondary burial of the father's bones. He's already dead. And so you can see why maybe the priority is not this important, Jesus says, but it's not as important as following me. So this bone box of Caiaphas is actually quite ornate, quite intricate, and you can see images of this if you Google it online. And if you go to the Jesus of Nazareth exhibit at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and I hope you get a chance to go there at some point, it's pretty cool. They've got some artifacts related to Jesus and his times, and one thing that's there is the Pontius Pilate stone is there, and another thing you'll see there is the ossuary of Caiaphas, the bone box. It's very, very beautiful example. Some are more plain. This one is quite beautiful, befitting that of a high priest. So that's the second of the top 10 archaeological discoveries related to Jesus and his world, the ossuary of Caiaphas. I want to also add a third one. Number 3 is the crucified remains of a man who in fact was, like Jesus, crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate. This is pretty amazing stuff. A heel bone, a 2,000-year-old heel bone of this guy, complete with this crucifixion spike embedded in the heel bone, was unearthed. And this is a pretty amazing find, because there have been all kinds of people, well, maybe not all kinds, but certain scholars throughout the years who have claimed that Jesus was never resurrected. In fact, he was never even properly buried. I'm thinking specifically of the ex-Catholic priest and biblical scholar, Dr. John Dominic Crossan, who claimed very famously that Jesus never received a proper burial, that his body was, well, either left to rot on the cross, where it was eaten by birds of prey, birds of carrion, or after Jesus died on the cross, it was unceremoniously thrown into a shallow grave where it was then eaten by wild dogs. So, wow, this is quite a theory. In fact, in one of his books, John Dominic Crossan, he even calls this chapter "The Dogs Beneath the Cross." Now, I will say this, that sometimes things like this did happen, where the Romans would crucify Jewish rebels, for example, and they would leave the bodies on the crosses to rot. They would leave the bodies. It was a gruesome sight. And historical writers did note this. They would sometimes throw the bodies into a shallow grave, and they would be eaten by wild animals. But this only happened during times of insurrection, such as during the Great Jewish War with Rome from 66 to 70 AD, later in the first century, that resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. But during the time of Jesus' crucifixion, there was peace between the Romans and the Jews. And in fact, like I alluded to before, Lucas, Caiaphas, the high priest, was in cahoots with Pilate. They were collaborating to keep the peace. And there is no way Pilate was going to risk a riot in the holy city during Passover, because the population of Jerusalem would swell hugely because of the feast. Thousands, tens of thousands more, maybe hundreds of thousands, possibly more people were in the city during the feast. And Pilate was already in some trouble with his Roman bosses for putting down a rebellion in a very bloody manner. And in fact, Jesus alludes to this in the Gospel of Luke. He talks about those whose blood Pilate mingled with their sacrifices. There was some sort of a disturbance in the temple, and Pilate dealt with it in a very heavy-handed way, and lots of people were killed. Well, Pilate was on a pretty short leash, so there was no way he's going to risk a riot, because Jesus had a lot of followers. Even those who did not believe he was the Messiah would have been greatly offended if Jesus did not receive a proper burial. Now, he didn't receive an honorable burial because he was crucified as a criminal, but he did receive, in fact, a proper burial in the borrowed tomb donated by Joseph of Arimathea. Lucas, when we were in Jerusalem, Dr. Craig Evans and I, we were working under the supervision of this archaeological dig, the supervision of Dr. Shimon Gibson, a famous British Jewish archaeologist. And he had this to say in one of his writings about the burial of Jesus and how Joseph pleaded with Pilate successfully for the body of Jesus. He said this, quote, "Joseph's plea on religious grounds would not have been ignored by the Roman authorities. Josephus testifies to the fact that the Romans did not," by the way, Josephus is a great historian of the times. He's very reliable for information, even about Jesus. He writes about Jesus too, and what was going on at the times, roughly contemporary with Jesus. Josephus testifies to the fact that the Romans did not require their Jewish subjects to violate their religious laws. I surmise he would have argued that respect be accorded to the executed man. Based on the prevalent Jewish custom of the time, the dead bodies must not be left exposed to be eaten by wild animals and buzzards. It was vital that the body of Jesus be buried before sundown and at the beginning of the Sabbath, when burials were prohibited. Instructions are provided in the book of Deuteronomy. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is to be put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall in any wise bury him that day. Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. So, end of quote. That's from Dr. Shimon Gibson. So this idea that Jesus would never have received a proper burial is pretty far out. It doesn't cohere with anything that we know. But here's where archaeology also saved the day for us too, because in 1968, in a place called Givat HaMivtar, which is part of Jerusalem, a neighborhood, a group from the Ministry of Housing found some ancient tombs once again that date from the 2nd century BC all the way to the 1st century AD. So this is again right smack dab around the time of Jesus. And in one of those tombs, they found an ossuary, another bone box, the bones of a man who was between 24 and 28, maybe he was 27, we're not quite sure 100%, who had been crucified. And how do we know he was crucified? Well, his heel bones still contain the spike from the crucifixion. And this is an extremely rare find because the Romans were not exactly concerned about sanitation when it came to crucifixions. They would reuse the spikes again and again and again. So it's hard to find them, actually. There have been a few that have been found through archaeology, but they wouldn't put Purell on them or anything. They just use them for the next guy. But this time, they couldn't get the spike out of this victim because it's about 11 and a half centimeters long, this iron spike. It fish hooked at the end. And I'm not sure why. It might have hit a knot in the wood and just kind of bent it back, or sometimes they laid people down. Again, there's a lot of limestone on the ground there, and maybe the nail went right through the cross and then kind of bent back. But they couldn't extract it, so they had to pull the whole thing out and bury him with the spike attached. Now you can see, if you go to the Jesus of Nazareth exhibit at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, you can see a replica of the heel bone with the spike in it. It's part of the... Now, this is important because this guy was also crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate, just as Jesus was, and he received a proper burial. So there's no reason to believe that Jesus did not receive a proper burial. Now, I've seen the real heel bone, Lucas, and it's located at the offices of Dr. Israel Hershkovitz at Tel Aviv University. He's considered sort of the bone collector of Israel. It's pretty macabre sometimes when you go into his office. He's got all these skeletons, all these ancient bones. And we said, Dr. Hershkovitz, we understand that you have the actual 2,000-year-old heel bone of this man. And his name was Yehohanan, which essentially translates to John. It was written on his ossuary, his bone box. We understand that you have this 2,000-year-old heel bone with the spike still in it. Can we see it? Oh, he said, oh, yeah. So he brings out this shoe box. And I mean, I'm telling you, I can't believe he has got something so valuable in a shoe box. Opens it up, leaves us in the room. It was myself, Greg Manette, Dr. Craig Evans. We're in this room. And he says, guys, just don't touch it. Just don't touch it. I'll be back. And so we were able to take pictures of this thing. Unbelievable. I couldn't believe he left us alone with it. And then he keeps it in his shoebox, number one. But this is incredible evidence that shows us that, yeah, the crucifixion account, the account of the burial of Jesus does cohere with what we know happened during his time. So that's really important. So you can see these three artifacts: the Pontius Pilate inscription, the replica of the heel bone, the real thing is with Israel Hershkovitz, and then the ossuary of Caiaphas, Pilate Caiaphas, of course, teaming up to condemn Jesus to death. These are all in the Jesus of Nazareth wing or exhibit in the Israel Museum. That's pretty cool. So those are the top three. And again, these aren't necessarily ranked all in order of importance, but these are the top 10 archaeological finds related to Jesus and his world. Number 4 is the bone box of James. And this is, of course, the guy who's known as the quote-unquote brother of the Lord. He's not, of course, a son of Mary. Mary only has one child, that's Jesus. But James was, I think, probably a relative of Jesus. We can maybe get into this in another episode. He was the Bishop of Jerusalem in the first century. He is the author of the letter of James in the New Testament. And he was also a skeptic who did not believe in Jesus during his ministry. And in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about a special resurrection appearance that Jesus made to James. It's part of an ancient creed of the church, and St. Paul quotes it. Yeah, that would probably convince me too, if Jesus personally appeared to me risen from the dead. Of course, he became a martyr as well. Well, in 2002, quite a stir was created in the international community. This made the news when an amazing discovery was announced. An ossuary from the first century, this bone box, and it had this inscription on it. I'm going to read the Aramaic inscription, and I'll translate it for you in English. But in Aramaic, it said, Yaakov bar Yosef Akui du Yeshua. What does that mean? It means James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, say, hang on here. What's going on? There is a tradition, especially in the eastern part of the church, that Joseph had children from a previous marriage, and his wife had died. And then he simply takes on Mary as a guardian. Makes sense. Seems like she made a vow of virginity, noted in Luke chapter 1. And so that could explain who these quote unquote brothers and sisters of Jesus are that are mentioned in the New Testament. It could be stepbrothers, stepsisters, children of Joseph from his first marriage. That's one explanation. You don't have to buy that. Again, that's another show for another day. But if this is in fact the Jesus, that was of course Jesus of Nazareth, God the Son incarnate, then this is probably the first thing that we have in writing with his name on it. This is pretty amazing. Well, this was announced in October of 2002. And there's a court case that went into this ossuary. In fact, the owner of this ossuary is a guy named Oded Golan. And he was actually taken to court by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. There are a lot of people who thought this was a fake or a forgery. And there was a court case that went on for over 5 years. I mean, this is over half a decade. Greg Manette says that there are 12,000 pages of court documents involving this case. 138 expert witnesses were interviewed. And in 2012, Israeli judge Aaron Farkash cleared Oded Golan of all forgery charges. So it seems that this is authentic. It's not a forgery. And it seems to be, in fact, the bone box of James. Incredible stuff. So that's another great archaeological find relating to Jesus and his world. You're listening to the Cale Clark Show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and you might also be watching on YouTube. So what do you think so far, Lucas?
It's interesting. I think the heel bone is pretty wild. That is, and the fact that the spike is still, I mean, it's almost, yeah, I don't know. Just the fact that that doctor has it in a shoebox. Like, oh yeah, check this out, guys. You know? Like, cool, thanks. It's wild. It's cool because it's anytime I feel like it's kind of a bolster to your faith when you're like, oh yeah, like this really did happen. Like there's historical evidence like that literally exists from that time period that points to the reality that these people existed, and it's not just a made up story. And it's neat. So I'm curious to see what these next 5 are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are written from the testimony of ancient historians, non-Christian historians, by the way, who wrote about Jesus being crucified under the reign of Pilate. We have some literary evidence of the existence of Jesus outside the Bible as well. But we're sticking here in this episode to archaeological evidence that's been found related to Jesus in his world. But again, we're not talking about the shroud. The shroud, which I do think is legit, is the actual burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth himself. So we do have something actually personally related to Jesus here. But these are before the shroud was kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, shrouded in some controversy up until very recently, when the latest science has shown that this is in fact from the first century, from the time of Jesus. And again, we did a whole show about this, but who else could it be given the evidence? But these are some of the other great finds. And here's another one. This is pretty cool. This is a first century Galilean fishing boat. Of course, the apostles, many of them were fishermen by trade. Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the Zebedean Sons Fishing Company, if you will. This is a cool find. This happened in 1986, and there was a great big drought that happened in Israel that year. And if you've ever been there, the Sea of Galilee it's not really a sea. It's actually a very, very large lake. And during this drought in 1986, the waters receded a lot. And in fact, that's what enabled this incredible first century find to be found. A couple of brothers from Magdala, Migdal, as it's known to the locals, the hometown of Mary Magdalene, 2 brothers, Moshe and Yuval Lufan. They were just kind of running along the beach. But again, because the waters had receded quite a bit with the drought, they were able to go a lot farther out than they used to. They came upon the ruins of what looked to be a fishing boat. And to their credit, the kids went, got the authorities, they came and checked it out. And sure enough, it was 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide. It turned out to be a 2,000-year-old boat from the time of Jesus that was perfectly preserved in the mud. There was no oxygen in the mud. That's what miraculously enabled this boat to be preserved for centuries. And carbon dating determined that the boat dates between 120 BC to 40 AD, somewhere in there. So yeah, now some people think, this is the actual, they call it the Jesus boat. This is in fact the actual boat that Jesus stepped into, maybe belonged to Simon Peter. This is where he fell asleep during the great storm on the Sea of Galilee. It may not be actually that same boat, but it would have, the boat that Jesus would have got into would have been exactly like this. Shelley Waxman, who's a nautical archaeologist, really a great specialty relating to underwater historical finds. He was the guy who was charged with getting this thing out of the mud intact. And it's incredible how this is done. In fact, there's a museum along the shores of Lake Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. It's called the Yigal Allon Museum in a place called Gennesaur, which is a kind of a kibbutz that's along the Sea of Galilee. Anyways, there's a museum there where they actually have the boat. You can go in and see this thing. It's unbelievable. You go in and you watch a movie. There's a movie that's on the screen where you watch a documentary film, if you will, of how they extracted the boat using the technology that they had in the 1980s. Incredibly. Keep it from breaking up, get it to the museum. And it's pretty awesome. You watch how Dr. Shelley Waxman and his team did this. And at the end of the film, the screen goes up and you actually see the boat there. It's kind of a nice reveal. It's pretty cool. And then you can actually, you can get pretty close to it. There's some barriers there, but you can look at it and see this boat. And when I was there, around the time when I was working on the archaeological dig with Dr. Evans, we're actually in this museum. We're watching the film. The screen goes up, you see the boat, and that particular day, guess who walked into the museum? Dr. Shelley Waxman himself, the guy who we just saw in the video, who just worked on the archaeology of this boat. He just happened to walk in. You never know who you're going to run into in Israel. So it was a pretty serendipitous moment. We had this incredible conversation with him. It was pretty wild. So the boat is made of at least 7 different types of wood, according to Greg Minette. Cedar, oak, cedar, Aleppo pine, hawthorn, willow, redbud. He talks about this in his book, The Wrong Jesus. The average size of a Galilean male, by the way, in Jesus' time was 5'5" and 140 pounds soaking wet. How about that? By the way, according to the Shroud, Jesus was about 5'10", so he was taller than most at that time. Anyway, so you could probably squeeze about 10, maybe 11, maybe 12 guys in that boat. It's just an amazing find. We'll never be able to prove whether this is in fact the boat that Jesus and maybe Simon Peter were in, or whether it belonged to the sons of Zebedee. Who knows? But this again just helps us to understand and appreciate the verisimilitude of the Gospels, that they're really like a key fitting into a lock. They cohere with reality. All of these finds that have been discovered, just kind of shedding light on Jesus and his world. So the Jesus boat, quote unquote, is another one of the top 10. I'd say number 6 would be the synagogues of Galilee from the first century that have been uncovered. When you go to Capernaum, and by the way, Capernaum was the home base of Jesus during his ministry. Of course, he's known as Jesus of Nazareth, but really he based himself out of Capernaum. And when you go to Capernaum, that was also the hometown of Simon and his brother Andrew, James and John, and some say even Matthew came from there as well. And it's pretty cool. They actually, now this isn't one of I could have easily put this in the list, but Peter's house has also been uncovered. And there's first century graffiti talking about the fact that this was Peter's house. And this is in fact where Jesus did exorcisms in Mark chapter 1 and healed people. And they came to him at night and they just spent so much time with these people because it was the Sabbath. They had to wait till evening to come to him when the Sabbath was over. And he's healing and exorcising demons all night. And then early in the morning, he's off to pray and they're out hunting for him in the woods. Where is Jesus? Anyway, so over Peter's house now, there's kind of a spaceship-looking church that was built in the 1970s. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. It's right over Peter's house. I think it's kind of a ghastly design, but Peter's house is there. And also The synagogue, the first century synagogue in Capernaum, is also there. And it's a great place to take a tour group. There's this nice little bench there. You can have everybody sitting down. You can kind of give them a little talk there. Now, what's there now, Lucas, is a fourth century limestone synagogue. That's not, what those are not the furnishings from the time of Jesus. But if you go around back of the synagogue building, if you look at the back of the foundation wall, you can see that underneath those limestones are other layers. And at the base, there are these black basalt stones, black volcanic rock. This stuff is all over the place in Israel, this volcanic rock. Lots of activity of volcanoes from way back when. So it's plentiful there. And they used it as a building material. Well, this black basalt stone that probably is the first century foundation of the Capernaum synagogue. And that's where Jesus preaches, by the way, his bread of life discourse, which is in John chapter 6, where he says, you've got to eat my flesh and drink my blood, or else you do not have life within you. Obviously preaching about the Eucharist. And then, of course, in John 6:51, the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. He tells us what the bread is. It's his flesh and blood. So it's pretty awesome stuff. So this is the very foundation that was probably laid by the Roman centurion. Remember in Matthew chapter 8, Luke chapter 7, the centurion who has the servant, Jesus heals the servant. And the people say, yeah, he's worthy, even though he's a Gentile, you should do this for him because he loves our people. And in fact, he built the synagogue here. So that's impressive. You can see that. And also in Magdala, I would throw in the synagogue in Magdala as well, just down the road from Capernaum, along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. There's a beautiful, by the way, just a beautiful church that has been built there now on the site. They found not only the synagogue, but the entire first century town of Magdala has been unearthed. And you can actually, it's different than Capernaum because, Lucas, the synagogue there, they actually have the first century mosaic tile floor that has been found. That's where Jesus himself would have walked when he was there, preaching in Magdala, casting the 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. It's an amazing, amazing place. And the reason why they were able to find the entire first century town intact was that during this great war with Rome from 66 to 70 AD, the inhabitants of Magdala realized that they were going to be attacked. They realized the Romans were going to probably desecrate the synagogue. So they decided to knock it down themselves. They literally brought the house down so that it would not be desecrated by the Romans. And the Romans did come and slaughtered hundreds of people and carried many more off into slavery. And so anyways, the whole first century village of Magdala has been found. It's a pretty awesome place to visit. And I was able to go there when it was still kind of being excavated. But now there's a great tourist site there. There's an incredible, as I said, little church there. You can actually, the altar is shaped like a boat that Jesus would have been preaching out of. It's pretty awesome. You can actually see through the glass behind. It looks like the altar / boat is floating. It's pretty awesome. And you can see the shores of and the Sea of Galilee behind. So it's a pretty cool place to take a group to. What do you think so far, Lucas?
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, the boat, I think, is really cool. Like, I would love to see that. But it's just mind blowing to me. Like, I'm trying to picture myself if I was one of these people that is just out going for a walk, and then all of a sudden you run into this 2,000-year-old artifact, and you're just like, it's just there. I mean, it's just mind boggling from like an American perspective. Like we think like if something's like 150 years old that it's old.
Yeah.
But so the idea of thinking of something like encountering something that's 2,000 years old is hard to imagine. But yeah, I mean, Cale, since you've been there in person, I mean, is there anything from the artifacts that you've mentioned so far that you were like that physically like seen, or at least the environment around the place that you were like most, I guess, like surprised by, or kind of that you found most moving or interesting, or
that's a tough question. I'd have to say that for me, one of my favorite places to go, I mean, Magdala is an incredible site. I would say that right now, I would have said Capernaum before, Capernaum is also super historical, but what they've done at Magdala is just so beautiful. How they've set it up for groups to come there, and the beautiful church that they've built with the altar slash boat inside is pretty awesome. And there's really echoes of that quote unquote Jesus boat that's in the museum down the road there. That to me, because we have the actual first century floor of the synagogue where Jesus would have walked, this beautiful mosaic tile. Yeah, it just gives you chills. It really does. And there's speaking of other historical finds, I just want to mention that the last few really quickly. I want to mention the village of Nazareth itself. And that's another place where you can go, and there's a beautiful basilica there, the Basilica of the Annunciation, which is one of the biggest churches in the world, really, is located there. This is the hometown of Jesus. And there are some who question whether Nazareth was a real place, too. But there have been some finds that have kind of shown that, yeah, it is real. In fact, when you look at Luke's gospel, you know how Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, who is a priest, it was his turn to be on duty in the temple. There were these priestly courses, these divisions, these groups of priests who were assigned ahead of time to serve in the temple. There was an inscription that was found on a stone tablet that talks about the priestly courses, and it says the 8th course is Hapizes of Nazareth. Now, this stone was discovered in a synagogue at Caesarea Maritima. Remember, Caesar's by the sea, in a synagogue that dates to the 3rd century, maybe the 4th century. So it mentions Nazareth specifically there. But also in 2009, Israeli archaeologists discovered what they found was one of the first dwellings, if not the first house ever built in Nazareth. Now, Nazareth was pretty small. There were only about 400 souls who lived there in Jesus's day. And it was very common. It used to be very common to say that Jesus was from the sticks, if you will. He was from a country bumpkin, if you will. Like Larry Bird, my favorite basketball player of all time, who played for the Boston Celtics. He was from a place called French Lick, Indiana. So they used to call him the Hick from French Lick. And he was much, much more than that. He was pretty savvy. And of course, Jesus was much more than a country bumpkin. He was the incarnate Son of God. Having said that, Nazareth may have been a pretty small town, but right next to it, just a few kilometers away, you could walk there, was the very large city of Sepphoris. And this is probably the city that Jesus had in mind when he said in the Sermon on the Mount that a city built on a hill cannot be hidden. And Sepphoris was in fact built on a hill, and it would have been visible to the inhabitants of Nazareth at night. You could see it across the way, and it would have been a beautiful sight with torches lighting up the town at night. It would have been a city on a hill, a shining city on a hill, as Jesus talked about. And by the way, Sepphoris was in fact, according to church tradition, the hometown of the Blessed Virgin Mary and her parents, Saints Joachim and Saint Anne, the grandparents of Jesus. So it's more than probable that Jesus made many trips to Sepphoris. There is a Greek theater there. That's where they think Jesus got this idea of the hypocrites from. It means play actors. He might have witnessed the comings and goings around these plays that took place. There's a lot of language like that in the Sermon on the Mount. Again, another talk for another day. But there's a famous archaeologist named Jody Magnus. She teaches at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she says this: Nazareth was, quote, an out-of-the-way hamlet of around 50 houses on a patch of about 4 acres, populated by Jews of modest means. And again, it was very close to Sepphoris, and also Tiberias wasn't too far away either. But what did the people there do? There's some terrace farming stuff going around. But there would have been plenty of work for Joseph and Jesus, these great building projects that Herod Antipas started in Sepphoris, including the theater. There would have been lots of work for these tektons, this Greek word that means, it's translated sometimes as carpenter, but it means more than that. Could be a modern day architect or engineer. There are elements of that in the work probably of Jesus and Joseph. So there's the village of Nazareth itself. And just a couple more I want to mention here. The Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, that's worthy of its own show, Lucas. We should do that one day. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. in Qumran, the caves outside of Qumran, in this desert region, um, very, very close to the Dead Sea. Some shepherds were looking for their lost sheep. How biblical. And one of the young shepherd boys, and there are lots of Bedouin that still live, and it's amazing when you see these guys because they live much as people would have 2,000 years ago in the desert. This Bedouin shepherd was looking for a lost sheep, and he thought maybe his sheep had wandered off into one of these caves in the mountains. And so he actually picked up a rock and he threw it into the cave, maybe hoping to startle the sheep. And he heard a crash. He's like, what the heck is that? And so he scampers up the small little mountain there. He goes into the cave and he finds that his rock had shattered this pottery jar. And inside the jar were these documents, some made of leather, some made of papyrus scrolls. And he thought, this is kind of interesting. And he took the leather home and he showed it to his dad. And his dad said, this would probably make a good pair of sandals. It's a good thing he didn't do that because it turned out to be one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was written on a leather. It's called vellum. This leather. That was the motif, if you will, of the time. Sometimes they used parchment. Sometimes they'd use leather to write on. And these are this is an incredible find. This is the greatest archaeological find related to the Bible of the 20th century. Hundreds of documents, about 900 documents, manuscripts. Some of them are just little fragments found in these jars, and they're almost perfectly preserved because of the climate, this dry desert climate, dating from the 3rd century BC all the way to the 1st century AD. Unbelievable. Even like scholars were just amazed by this. And in these various caves, and cave 4 was kind of the mother lode. They found most of the scrolls in cave number 4. And these are not, by the way, they're not Christian documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of people think they are. They are not. It's a combination of biblical books and other Jewish writings related to this group that had them. And most people think it's the Essenes that lived in the desert. They were a Jewish sect of the time. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, groups like that, various groups. And there's also the Essenes. They had certain beliefs. They were pretty apocalyptic. They thought that even the Pharisees weren't holy enough. The high priest had become corrupt. They obviously wanted to get rid of the Roman emperor. They envisioned this big eschatological battle at the end of time, in which they actually thought there were going to be 2 messiahs, a priestly messiah and a kingly messiah, if you can imagine that. And it's kind of interesting because in Jesus, we have prophet, priest, and king combined in the same person. So the kingly messiah would actually slay the Roman emperor, who they called the king of the Gentiles, the king of the Kittim, and he would kill him. That would be, this would be the end of the apocalyptic war. Anyways, the scrolls don't tell us anything about Jesus, but they do tell us what people were expecting of the Jewish Messiah. And a lot of stuff that's put in these scrolls, Jesus actually did this stuff, like raising the dead, healing the lame, all the stuff. When the Messiah comes, he will do this, echoing the book of Isaiah. And speaking of Isaiah, that's one of the biggest finds within the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Great Isaiah Scroll. This was 1,000 years older than the oldest copy that we had at the time of the book of Isaiah, and yet it's the exact same as the book of Isaiah today. So people have this theory about the Bible that's become hopelessly corrupted, as they're making copies of copies throughout the centuries. It's like a game of telephone. They get it wrong. And no, we've got the same book of Isaiah dated to, hundreds of years before Christ that we have today, the Masoretic Hebrew text, just a couple minor blips, but it's essentially the same thing. So the scribes took great care with preserving the text of the Old Testament. They do shed light on some of the teachings of Jesus. And again, that's another show for another day. And then the last thing I want to mention here, this is the 9th item. It's called the Shroud Tomb. And this has nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin, Lucas. The Shroud Tomb is something else. And believe me, this is real Indiana Jones stuff. In fact, I got to go into the Shroud tomb when I was working on this archaeological dig. We did a side trip to the Valley of Hinnom. It's also known as Gehenna. If you know your Bible, Lucas, and I know you do, this is
But
the
you went to
word that
hell.
Jesus, yeah, that's right. This is the word that Jesus used to describe hell. He called it Gehenna. So I went there. I can literally say I've been to hell and back, and I live to tell the tale. So what is this place? It's a valley outside of Jerusalem where a lot of people were buried. In fact, the tomb of Caiaphas was actually in Gehenna. Can you imagine this? Remember I told you about that ossuary, the bone box of Caiaphas. So a lot of tombs are there, and Jesus used this word, this place, to describe hell because it was the worst thing you could think of. I mean, there was in the Old Testament, it talks about uh, sacrifices that were made there, tragic sacrifices that were made to demons. There was a garbage dump there that was continually burning. The smell of rotting whatever was just constantly in the air. This fire that never went out, it seemed. And Jesus uses this as a metaphor for hell. And of course, the real thing is far worse. But that's where this tomb was located. There's lots of first century tombs there. And again, just recently, just a few years ago, this often happens. Kids are like playing in these tombs and they find this stuff. And that's exactly what happened. Some children went into this tomb and they saw something there and they thought, we better tell the authorities. They did. And sure enough, they come and look at it. Dr. Shimon Gibson, who I worked with in Israel, he comes and looks at this and he says, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. And this thing was, we went into this tomb with Dr. Craig Evans, Lucas. And again, it was very much like Indiana Jones. You had to slide down this passageway. It was a very narrow passageway into this antechamber. Then eventually you went down into the actual first century tomb. It's spooky as could possibly be. I actually posted some videos of this on the YouTube channel. They're from long ago, but you can check them out. It is pretty wild stuff. Now, what did they find there? Well, most things were missing because, again, grave robbers can get into these tombs. They take anything of value. But one thing they didn't touch, and it was for a good reason. There was something there. There was a body that was laid out in what's called a coke. Kokim is the plural. This is kind of I guess you could say, like, this is where they would lay out a body. There'd be sort of a hole dug in the tomb. They would lay a body out. This is where Jesus would have been laid, something like this. And then he's, the body's anointed, wrapped in the shroud. And then, of course, they're supposed to come back a year later to get the bones, put them in a bone box, and then that's a secondary burial. That's when that takes place. But they found there a skeleton that was almost 2,000 years old. Again, it was from around the time of Jesus, the decade of the 30s in the first century. But this man who had been buried had never been, secondary burial never took place. They found a shroud covering a skeleton. Now, why was this guy never given his final rest, his final resting place? Well, there's a good reason for that. Because under the shroud, they found a piece of flesh attached to the skull. It was, again, almost 2,000 years old. And because of the coolness of the tomb, the conditions there, this one little piece of flesh did not decompose. It was a miracle, really, because the rest of the body did decompose. They analyzed it, and they found out what the guy died of. He died of Hansen's disease. In other words, leprosy. Now, this is very important because there are some people who were skeptical of the Gospels as historical documents. Who used to say that Jesus could not have healed lepers in the first century. He couldn't have healed leprosy because Hansen's disease didn't exist back then. We don't have evidence of Hansen's disease until much later time periods. Oh, yeah? Well, now we do. Here's a guy who died in the first century, around the time of Jesus, who died of leprosy, and we can prove that. So it did exist in Jesus' day. So this, again, helps us to show the verisimilitude of the Gospels, that they do, in fact, cohere with the way things really were back in the day. So Add to that the Shroud of Turin, you've got the top 10. I'm just going to run, just in closing, just to repeat them for you. The first century stone inscription referring to Pontius Pilate, that's number 1. Number 2 is the bone box of Caiaphas, the high priest. Number 3, the crucified remains of Yehohanan, who was crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate as well. He got a proper burial, just as Jesus did. It helps to verify that. Number 4, the ossuary, the bone box of James, the Bishop of Jerusalem, the host, if you will, of the first ecumenical council of the church, the Council of Jerusalem, which is talked about in Acts chapter 15. He didn't believe in Jesus before the resurrection. He certainly did afterwards. Number 5, the so-called Jesus boat, which was discovered in Lake Galilee during a drought in 1986, and you can see it in the Guinness Museum now. First century fishing vessel from Jesus' time. Number 6, the foundations of first century synagogues in Galilee, Capernaum, and Magdala, even more impressively, where Jesus preached. Number 7, the village of Nazareth, the existence of it. It is a real place. Number 8, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Number 9, what I call the Shroud Tomb. This is the shroud of the leprosy victim. And number 10, the Shroud of Turin itself. So those are the top 10 archaeological finds relating to Jesus and his world. We did it in about an hour, Lucas.
I'm impressed. I only have one question for you, Cale.
Sure.
When are you going to be going back to Israel, and can I join?
Oh, 100%. That is job number 1, to get back there, take a pilgrimage group there. And of course, with the as we're recording this, of course, the very dire situation in the Middle East with wars on different fronts there. It's obviously not necessarily a safe time to go, or at least a time where people would feel safe going. So we certainly pray for the peace of Jerusalem and of the Middle East in general. And we hope to get back there very, very soon. But you will be, I'll guarantee you, a spot on my list. Let's put it that way, Lucas.
Yes. All right. Sounds good.
All right. Well,
Cool.
I just want to thank everyone for listening or watching. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to be notified of future videos that come out. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify to The Cale Clark Show, we'll ask you very humbly if you wouldn't mind giving us a rating and a review, because that does help people to discover the show. And use the fancy, well, they're actually not that fancy. They're actually pretty simple. Those share tools, that little arrow where you can share it with a friend from your smartphone or from your computer. We'd so appreciate that. And once again, go to caleclark.com, C-A-L-E, Clark with an E.com. Sign up for the email list there, and we'll be sure to notify you of new episodes as soon as they come out. So for producer Lucas Holt, who's going to get some rest, he's a little under the weather, and we'll pray that he feels better. This is Cale Clark signing off for this episode. We'll catch you in the next one. God love you. Peace.